The diner went dead silent when the super soldiers walked in. 9-foot tall, genetically forged monsters known as dragons, feared by the entire galaxy. They didn't flinch at the armed thugs circling them. But they froze completely when a 20-year-old human waitress poured their coffee and casually whispered, "My mom has your tattoo." The neon sign of the rusty rivet flickered with a persistent, annoying hum, casting sickly blue light across the rain-slicked asphalt of Dust Creek. It was a miserable little colony on the ragged edge of the outer rim, a place where people went when they wanted to disappear, or when the rest of the galaxy had already forgotten them. Inside the diner, the air was thick with the smell of scorched synthetic grease, stale cheap tobacco, and the ozone tang of unwashed mining suits. Abigail Mercer stood behind the scuffed Formica counter, wiping down the surface with a rag that had seen better decades. At 22, Abigail possessed a hardened, weathered beauty, her eyes a sharp, observant hazel that always seemed to be calculating the nearest exit. She wore a faded denim uniform, a name tag pinned crookedly over her heart, and a heavy iron wrench tucked discreetly into the deep pocket of her apron. On a border world like Dust Creek, a waitress had to be part therapist, part bartender, and part riot police. It was a slow Tuesday night, just past standard midnight. The usual crowd was huddled in the booths, a few exhausted helium miners from the local rig, a couple of drifters nursing synthetic coffees, and a rough-looking syndicate crew playing a hushed game of cards in the back corner. Abigail poured a fresh pot of chicory blend coffee, her thoughts drifting to the mounting pile of medical debts sitting on her cramped apartment's kitchen table. Her mother, Catherine, had passed away 5 years ago, leaving Abigail with nothing but a rusted locket, a mountain of unpaid bills, and a set of strict, paranoid rules for survival. Never look a soldier in the eye, Abby. Never ask about the war. And if you ever see a man with scales, you run. Those words echoed in Abigail's mind, just as the heavy plasteel doors of the diner hissed open. A violent gust of freezing, rain-soaked wind whipped through the establishment, rattling the napkin dispensers and extinguishing the cheap synthetic candles on the tables. The low hum of conversation died instantly. The clinking of silverware stopped. Even the syndicate men in the back lowered their cards, their hands subtly drifting beneath the table toward their concealed blasters. 3 figures stepped over the threshold. They had to stoop to avoid taking out the doorframe. They were massive, easily standing over 7 feet tall, draped in heavy, weather-beaten trench coats that failed to conceal the sheer, unnatural bulk of their frames. But it wasn't just their size that brought the diner to a terrifying, breathless halt. It was what they were. Underneath the dripping hoods of their coats, thick, armored scales caught the dim diner light, shifting in hues of charcoal and deep, bruised purple. Their jaws were squared and human, but their eyes were something else entirely, vertical slits of burning amber set against sclera as black as the void of space. Heavy, jagged dermal plating ran down the sides of their necks, and their hands, though clad in fingerless leather gloves, ended in short, brutal talons. They were Project Leviathan veterans, the Earth Coalition's greatest, most controversial triumph during the Centauri Wars. Genetically spliced human volunteers mixed with the DNA of an apex predator species from the deep core. The galaxy called them dragons. They were meant to be the ultimate shock troops, immune to standard plasma fire, strong enough to rip the turret off a heavy tank, and fiercely loyal. But when the war ended, the Coalition didn't know what to do with a battalion of heavily traumatized, unstoppable apex predators. So, the government abandoned them, stripped them of their ranks, denied them medical treatment for the excruciating cellular degradation of their splicing, and left them to rot on the fringes of civilized space. Now, the dragons were outcasts, feared by the public and hunted by Coalition sweepers. Seeing one was rare. Seeing 3, fully armed and walking into a civilian diner, was a death sentence. The leader of the trio stepped forward, his heavy combat boots cracking the linoleum floor. He pushed his hood back, revealing a face mapped with horrific, jagged plasma scars. One of his amber eyes was milky and blind, a deep gouge running vertically through it. He looked around the diner, his gaze sweeping over the terrified patrons with cold, clinical indifference. Behind him stood 2 others. One was leaner, his scales a sickly, pale gray, his hands twitching with an underlying nervous energy. The third was a behemoth, even by dragon standards, his massive shoulders scraping the ceiling tiles, carrying a heavy, canvas-wrapped object on his back that looked suspiciously like a military-grade rotary cannon. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her mother's voice screamed in her head to run, to drop the rag and bolt out the kitchen, fire escape. But her feet remained rooted to the spot. She watched as the three massive veterans slowly made their way to a corner booth, the largest one in the diner. They slid into the cracked leather seats, the material groaning under their immense weight. No one moved. No one spoke. The air in the diner was so thick with tension it felt like trying to breathe underwater. The leader, the one with the scarred face, picked up a sticky, laminated menu. He didn't even look up at the terrified patrons staring at him. He just studied the breakfast options with quiet intensity. Abigail swallowed hard, her throat dry. She looked at the old diner owner, a crusty man named Higgins, who was currently cowering behind the deep fryer, frantically shaking his head and mouthing the word no at her. Abigail closed her eyes for a brief second. If she didn't serve them, they might get angry. If the local toughs got brave, people would die. Someone had to break the ice, and the rent was due on Friday. She tightened the strings of her apron, picked up a fresh pot of coffee and 3 thick ceramic mugs, and walked out from behind the counter. Every step Abigail took felt like walking through molasses. The heavy silence in the rusty rivet magnified the sound of her scuffed sneakers squeaking against the cheap floor. The syndicate thugs in the back were watching her with a mix of pity and morbid curiosity. Before Abigail could reach the dragon's booth, a chair scraped violently against the floorboards. Brody, a notoriously volatile foreman from the helium rigs, stood up. He was a massive, bruising man in his own right, heavily modified with cheap, black market cybernetics. Tonight, he was also heavily intoxicated, fueled by cheap, synthetic whiskey and a misplaced sense of local pride. "Hey!" Brody slurred, his cybernetic arm whirring loudly as he pointed a thick, metal finger at the corner booth. "Who said you freaks could drink here?" Abigail froze, clutching the coffee pot to her chest. No, Brody, you idiot, sit down," she prayed silently. The 3 dragons didn't even acknowledge his existence. The scarred leader turned a page of his menu. The lean, twitchy one was staring at the ceiling, seemingly counting the water stains. The behemoth simply sat there, his massive hands resting on the table as motionless as a statue. Brody, enraged by the dismissal, took a heavy, staggering step forward. His crew of 4 miners stood up behind him, their hands dropping to the heavy mining lasers holstered at their hips. "I'm talking to you, Scalies," Brody barked, his face flushing dark purple. "This is a human bar. We don't serve government mutts. We don't serve war crime abominations. Drag your scaly hides out of that booth and crawl back to whatever toxic swamp you." Before the word could fully leave Brody's lips, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a sudden explosion of movement, but rather a terrifying, instantaneous repositioning of reality. 1 second, the lean, gray-scaled dragon was leaning back in his booth. The next second, he was standing directly in front of Brody. Abigail hadn't even seen him move. It was a blur of motion that defied biology. Brody gasped, startled, and instinctively drew a heavy plasma blade from his belt, igniting it with a deadly electric crackle. The gray dragon didn't flinch. With a movement so precise it bordered on artistic, he raised his left hand and caught Brody's cybernetic wrist. Metal shrieked and buckled as the dragon's talons dug effortlessly into the hardened titanium plating. Brody screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, as the dragon twisted the wrist, forcing the plasma blade to deactivate and drop to the floor. The miners' crew drew their weapons, but before they could aim, the behemoth dragon in the booth simply slammed his open palm onto the table. The sound was like a localized thunderclap. "Enough," a voice commanded. It was the scarred leader. He hadn't stood up. He hadn't raised his voice. But the word carried a deep, resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate the marrow in Abigail's bones. It was a voice used to commanding battalions in the fires of hell. "Bradley, release him," the leader ordered, his blind eye fixed on the menu. The lean dragon, Bradley, tilted his head, his amber eyes burning into Brody's terrified face. For a second, his jaw unhinged slightly, revealing rows of serrated predatory teeth. Then, just as quickly, he let go. Brody collapsed to the floor, clutching his crushed, smoking cybernetic arm, whimpering like a beaten dog. "Take your friend and leave," the leader said, his tone flat, entirely devoid of emotion. "We are only here for the coffee." The miners didn't hesitate. They hauled Brody off the floor and practically trampled each other, trying to get out the front door, leaving a trail of rainwater and terror in their wake. The diner fell back into a stunned, breathless silence. Bradley casually walked back to the booth and slid into his seat, adjusting his trench coat. Abigail stood 5 feet away, her heart thrashing in her throat. She had just witnessed a display of lethal force that could have wiped out the entire room in seconds. Her hands were shaking so badly that the coffee pot was rattling against the ceramic mugs she held. "Run!" her survival instinct screamed. Instead, Abigail took a deep breath, forced her shoulders down, and stepped up to their table. "Sorry about the noise," Abigail said, her voice remarkably steady, though it cracked slightly on the last syllable. She placed the 3 mugs on the table. "Brody's an idiot on a good day. Black coffee, or do you want the synthetic cream?" All 3 dragons stopped what they were doing. For the first time, they looked at her. Really looked at her. The behemoth blinked in confusion. Bradley leaned forward, sniffing the air near her subtly, his slit pupils dilating. The scarred leader slowly lowered his menu, his good eye locking onto her face. He looked genuinely baffled. "You are not retreating," the leader noted, his deep voice holding a hint of genuine curiosity. "Your heart rate is currently 140 beats per minute. You are experiencing acute terror. Yet, you approach." "I'm experiencing acute poverty, sir," Abigail replied, pouring the steaming black liquid into their mugs. "And the rent is due. Now, do you want to order? Or are you just going to read the laminated pictures all night?" A low, rumbling sound emanated from the behemoth's chest. It took Abigail a moment to realize it was a chuckle. "We will take the synthetic protein slabs," the leader said, a faint ghost of respect in his tone. "Cooked black. No sides. And leave the pot. 3 slabs. Burnt to hell." "Got it," Abigail said, turning on her heel and marching back to the kitchen, her knees threatening to buckle with every step. She shoved the order ticket at a trembling Higgins, grabbed the counter to steady herself, and let out a long, shuddering breath. She had survived part 1. Now, she just had to feed them and get them out. 10 minutes later, Abigail emerged from the kitchen carrying a heavy, reinforced tray loaded with 3 massive, charred slabs of synthetic beef. The smell was sharp and smoky. The rest of the diner had completely emptied out. Even the syndicate men had decided to cut their losses and slip out the back door. It was just Abigail, a trembling cook hiding in the pantry, and 3 apex predators. She walked over to the booth, balancing the tray expertly on one hand. 3 synthetic steaks, well done, she announced, sliding the heavy, sizzling plates in front of the massive men. As she reached across the table to set down the leader's plate, he reached up to adjust his mug. The heavy, soaked fabric of his trench coat slipped back, revealing a thick, muscular forearm covered in dense, charcoal-colored scales. But it wasn't the scales that caught Abigail's eye. It was the ink. Scarred deeply into the flesh and scales of his inner forearm was a very specific, intricately detailed tattoo. It depicted a crimson sun, its rays weeping like fresh blood. Bisecting the sun was a shattered, ancient broadsword, the metallic shards suspended in midair. Wrapping around the entire image was a crown of jagged, emerald barbed wire. Abigail stopped breathing. The diner faded away. The hum of the neon sign, the relentless drumming of the rain outside it, all vanished. She knew that tattoo. She had seen it every day of her childhood. She had traced the lines of it with her tiny fingers when her mother read her to sleep. It was tattooed on her mother's right shoulder blade. Her mother had always told her it was a meaningless piece of rebel art she got in her reckless youth. But as Abigail grew older, she noticed how her mother always kept it hidden, how she flinched when the coalition guards checked their IDs at the colony borders, how she would stare at it in the mirror with a look of profound, agonizing grief. Abigail didn't realize she had dropped the empty serving tray until it hit the linoleum floor with a sharp, echoing clang. The three dragons looked up, their instincts flaring, instantly on alert. "My mom has your tattoo," Abigail whispered, the words slipping out of her mouth before she could stop them. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. Bradley, who had just picked up a heavy, serrated steak knife, dropped it. It clattered against the plate. The behemoth stopped chewing, his massive jaw freezing in place. But it was the leader who reacted the most violently. The stoic, emotionless giant who hadn't flinched when an armed mob surrounded him suddenly lunged forward. His massive, taloned hand shot across the table, wrapping around Abigail's wrist. He didn't squeeze hard enough to break it, but the grip was like a titanium vice. His amber eye widened, a sudden, desperate fire igniting in the pupil. "What did you say?" the leader demanded, his voice dropping to a terrifying, guttural growl that shook the table. I! Abigail stammered, panic finally overwhelming her bravery. She tried to pull back, but he held her firm. "Let me go!" "Gideon, ease up," the behemoth rumbled, his voice tight with an emotion Abigail couldn't identify. "Was it fear? You're scaring her." The leader, Gideon, blinked, looking down at his hand wrapped around her delicate human wrist. He instantly let go, recoiling as if he had been burned. He held his hands up in a gesture of surrender, his chest heaving with sudden, ragged breaths. "I apologize," Gideon said, his voice trembling slightly. The terrifying monster was suddenly gone, replaced by a desperate, frantic man. "Please, look at me. This mark. You said your mother bears this exact mark?" Abigail rubbed her wrist, stepping back. "Yes. A red, bleeding sun. A broken sword. Green, barbed wire. She has it on her shoulder." The three veterans exchanged a look that sent a chill down Abigail's spine. It was a look of disbelief, reverence, and profound, earth-shattering shock. "That is impossible," Bradley whispered, his voice cracking. He stood up slowly, looming over the table, staring down at Abigail. "That mark is the insignia of the 104th Experimental Battalion. Project Draco. The Forsaken. There were only 200 of us created. 199 died in the trenches of the Orion sector. We are the only 3 left," the behemoth added softly. "No," Gideon corrected, his eye locked onto Abigail with a terrifying, burning intensity. "There was one other who bore the mark. Not a soldier, a human. A coalition geneticist who realized what the military was doing to us. A medic who refused to let us be incinerated when the war ended." Abigail's blood ran cold. The Dinah felt like an icebox. "A medic?" she echoed, her mind spinning. "She was our creator and our savior," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a reverent, hushed tone. "When the generals ordered the extermination of the Draco Project, she falsified our death records. She smuggled us onto cargo freighters. She gave up her rank, her life, and her freedom to ensure we survived. We carved this mark into her flesh ourselves, so the universe would know she was under the eternal protection of the dragons." Gideon leaned forward, placing his massive hands flat on the table. "Girl, what is your mother's name?" Abigail felt the world tilting on its axis. Everything her mother had ever told her, the quiet life, the administrative job, the need to hide it, was all unraveling. "Catherine," Abigail whispered, tears suddenly pricking her eyes. "Catherine Mercer." The behemoth let out a choked gasp, burying his face in his massive hands. Bradley turned away, bracing his arms against the diner wall, his shoulders shaking as a low, keening sound escaped his throat. Gideon didn't move, but a single, thick tear welled up in his good eye and tracked down his scarred, scaled cheek. "Dr. Mercer," Gideon whispered, the name carrying the weight of a prayer. "The mother of dragons. We have been searching for her for a decade. We picked up a fragmented 10-year-old distress signal on this rim world, using old coalition cipher codes. We thought it was a trap. We never dreamed." He looked at Abigail, really studying her features. "You have her eyes, the same stubborn defiance." "You're too late," Abigail said, her voice breaking. the grief of 5 hard years finally bleeding through her tough exterior. She's gone. She died of core rot 5 years ago. I buried her myself. The silence that followed was heavier than a collapsed star. The veterans froze, the hope that had briefly illuminated their terrifying features snuffing out in an instant. But then, Gideon slowly shook his massive head. He reached into his heavy coat and pulled out a battered, military-grade encrypted datapad. He slid it across the table toward Abigail. "She didn't die, Abigail," Gideon said softly, his amber eye locked onto hers. "Core rot doesn't leave a biological signature, and Dr. Mercer inoculated herself against it before the war." Abigail looked down at the datapad. Glowing on the cracked screen was a biometric life signs tracker. It was flashing green. It was active. "Your mother isn't dead," Gideon said, his voice stealing into something hard and dangerous. "She was taken. And this tracker indicates she's being held in a Coalition black site, 3 parsecs from here. We came to this diner because this was the rendezvous point she established 12 years ago." Gideon stood up, his massive frame towering over her, casting a long, terrifying shadow. But for the first time, Abigail didn't feel afraid. She felt the heavy, comforting weight of absolute protection. "Get your coat, Abigail Mercer," the dragon commanded, picking up his rotary cannon. "We're going to get our mother back, and heaven help the Coalition fleet that tries to stop us." The freezing rain of Dust Creek pounded against Abigail's face, washing away the smell of scorched grease that had clung to her skin for 3 years. She marched through the mud behind the 3 towering figures, her heavy iron wrench bouncing in the deep pocket of her apron, her mind a chaotic storm of betrayal, hope, and sheer, unadulterated terror. They didn't have a speeder. They had something much worse. Hidden in the jagged cliffs behind the settlement's rusted atmospheric processors sat a ship. It was a decommissioned Coalition stealth corvette, its hull painted in radar-absorbent matte black, bristling with illegal aftermarket weapon pods. The vessel looked less like a spacecraft and more like a predatory shark resting in the mud. Stenciled on the side in faded gray paint was the name Ironclad. Gideon pressed his massive, scaled palm against the biometric scanner on the boarding ramp. The machine whirred, glowing a harsh green before the heavy hydraulic locks disengaged with a deafening hiss. "Get inside," Gideon ordered, his voice easily cutting through the howling wind. "Bradley, prep the sublight drives. Cole, spool up the rotary cannons. If the local syndicate tracks us, I want them vaporized before they can power their targeting scanners." The behemoth, Cole, gave a silent nod, his massive boots clanking heavily up the ramp. Abigail followed, stepping out of the storm and into a cabin that smelled of ozone, gun oil, and old leather. As the boarding ramp sealed shut behind them, plunging the cargo hold into dim red tactical lighting, the adrenaline that had been keeping Abigail upright suddenly evaporated. Her knees gave out. She collapsed onto a metal munitions crate, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. 5 years. She had spent 5 years visiting a hollow grave on a hill of synthetic dirt, crying until she had nothing left, working 16-hour shifts just to pay off the medical debts her mother had supposedly left behind. It was all a lie. The grief, the poverty, the absolute crushing loneliness. Gideon walked over to her, his heavy combat boots echoing softly on the grating. He knelt, a massive, imposing mountain of armor and muscle dropping to a knee so he could look her in the eye. "You are experiencing systemic shock," Gideon said, his tone clinical but underscored with a deep, rumbling gentleness. "Your heart rate is erratic. Your cortisol levels are spiking." "She lied to me," Abigail whispered, her voice cracking. She looked up at the scarred veteran. "I watched her die. I watched the Coalition doctors pull the sheet over her face in the quarantine ward. I saw the cremation urn. How could she do this to me?" Gideon sighed, a heavy, weary sound that spoke of decades of war. "The Earth Coalition does not simply let their lead geneticists retire, Abigail, especially not the ones who commit treason by stealing military property. When your mother saved the 104th Battalion, she painted a target on her back, and by extension, on yours." Gideon reached into a storage compartment on his tactical vest and pulled out a battered metal flask. He unscrewed the cap and handed it to her. "Drink. It is Terran whiskey. It will stabilize your nerves." Abigail took it with trembling hands and took a sip. It burned like battery acid, but the fire in her chest chased away the paralyzing cold of the rain. "Those medical debts you have been paying?" Gideon continued, his single amber eye locked onto hers. "Who exactly collects them?" Abigail coughed, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "A shell corporation. Meridian Holdings. They automatically deduct it from my credit account every month." "Meridian Holdings is a ghost company," Gideon explained. "We tracked its financial routing before we landed here. The credits you pay don't go to a hospital. They go to the Dust Creek local magistrate, the Port Authority, and the syndicate bosses. Your mother wasn't paying off a medical bill. She was paying a continuous, automated bribe to keep the entire planet looking the other way so you could live in peace. She faked her death to sever her connection to you, to keep you off the Coalition's radar." The revelation hit Abigail like a physical blow. The crushing weight of her resentment dissolved, replaced by a profound, agonizing realization of her mother's sacrifice. Catherine hadn't abandoned her. She had sentenced herself to a life on the run to buy Abigail's freedom. And now, the Coalition had finally caught her. From the cockpit, Bradley's voice crackled over the intercom. "Gideon, coordinates locked. Slip space rupture in 3 minutes. Destination, Outpost Jericho. It's a black site in the Caliban sector. Heavily fortified, Gideon stood up to his full, terrifying height of 9 feet. "Armor up," he commanded the room. From the shadows of the armory, Cole emerged. The behemoth had strapped heavily plated tungsten armor over his shoulders and chest. He carried his massive rotary cannon as easily as a human might carry a briefcase. He walked over to Abigail, his heavy footfalls making the deck vibrate. He reached out a massive, taloned hand. Resting in his palm was a standard-issue Coalition plasma pistol. It looked like a child's toy in his grip, but to Abigail it was a heavy, lethal piece of military hardware. "The recoil is severe," Cole rumbled, his voice deeper and slower than Gideon's. "Keep your elbows locked. Do not aim for the head. Aim for center mass. It will burn through standard infantry armor in less than a second." Abigail stared at the weapon. She was a waitress. Her most violent encounters involved hitting drunken miners with a wrench. But she thought of the tattoo on her mother's back. The red sun. The broken sword. The symbol of the dragons. Humanity had forged these monsters to fight their wars, but humanity was also capable of incredible, stubborn defiance. She took the pistol. Its weight felt cold and grounding in her hand. "I'm not staying on the ship," Abigail said, her hazel eyes hardening into flint. Gideon looked at her, his scarred face unreadable for a long moment. Then the corners of his mouth twitched upward in a grim, terrifying smile. "You are Dr. Mercer's blood. We would never insult you by asking you to stay behind." The ship lurched violently as the sublight drives kicked in, tearing a hole in the fabric of space. The ironclad slipped into the void, hurtling toward hell. Outpost Jericho did not look like a prison. It looked like a tomb. Suspended in the dead, freezing orbit of a collapsed star, the black site was a jagged fortress of black plasteel and blinking red warning lights. It was where the Coalition sent its most dangerous political prisoners, rogue operatives, and unauthorized scientists. It was a place designed to make people disappear forever. The ironclad dropped out of slip space directly above the station. They didn't hail port control. They didn't ask for docking clearance. "Kinetic breach!" Gideon roared from the cockpit. "Brace for impact!" Abigail strapped herself into a crash seat in the cargo hold, clutching the plasma pistol to her chest. Humans had built the dragons, and human engineering had given them ships that could withstand impossible punishment. The ironclad didn't slow down. It fired its forward thrusters, accelerating like a massive bullet directly toward the station's main hangar bay. The impact was cataclysmic. Metal shrieked in agony as the reinforced, pointed prow of the stealth corvette violently punctured the atmospheric shielding of Outpost Jericho, smashing through the reinforced hangar doors and embedding itself 30 meters deep into the station's primary deck. Sparks rained down like hellfire. Alarms shrieked through the station, bathing everything in strobing red emergency light. Before the station's automated defense turrets could even swivel to target the intruding ship, the ironclad's boarding ramp blew open with explosive force. The dragons unleashed themselves. It was a terrifying display of genetically modified superiority. Bradley moved first, a blur of pale gray scales and lethal efficiency. He didn't use firearms. He drew two monomolecular combat blades, leaping from the ramp and clearing 50 feet in a single bound. He landed amidst a squad of heavily armored coalition guards who were just raising their rifles. Bradley moved like a ghost, his blades carving through standard-issue tungsten plating as if it were wet parchment. He disabled 6 men before they could fire a single shot, leaving them groaning on the deck, their weapons sliced perfectly in half. Cole stepped out next. He didn't run. He just walked, planting his massive boots on the deck, raising the rotary cannon. A squad of reinforcements poured out of a blast door at the far end of the hangar. Cole squeezed the trigger. The deafening brrr of the heavy weapon shook the very air in Abigail's lungs. A storm of depleted uranium rounds shredded the blast door and the barricades behind it, turning the corridor into a cloud of pulverized concrete and twisting metal. Gideon moved with surgical precision. He flanked right, his plasma rifle barking in short, controlled bursts, neutralizing the automated ceiling turrets with terrifying accuracy. "Move up!" Gideon barked. "Tracker indicates level sub-9. Interrogation wing." Abigail unbuckled herself and sprinted down the ramp, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She stayed close behind Cole, using his massive, heavily armored frame as a moving wall. She kept her plasma pistol raised, her hands shaking, but her grip tight. They tore through the station like a force of nature. Coalition guards, trained to fight human insurgents and alien raiders, were entirely unprepared for the sheer, brutal ferocity of the Leviathan veterans. Panic spread through the comms channels. The guards were falling back, their morale breaking at the sight of the 9-foot monsters of legend, ripping heavy blast doors off their hinges with their bare hands. They reached level. At the end of the hall stood the interrogation chamber. The heavy vault door was sealed shut. "Cole!" Gideon commanded, gesturing to the vault. The behemoth slung his rotary cannon over his back. He stepped up to the massive steel doors, dug his taloned fingers into the minuscule seam between them, and planted his boots. He let out a deep, guttural roar, the muscles in his back bunching and straining. With a horrific screech of tearing metal, the hydraulic locks snapped, and Cole ripped the doors entirely off their tracks, tossing them aside like cardboard. Inside the stark, sterile white room, a man in a pristine gray coalition uniform stood behind a metal table. Director Alistair Reed. His face was pale, his arrogant demeanor shattered by the monstrous figures filling his doorway. Bound to a chair on the other side of the table was Catherine Mercer. She was older than Abigail remembered. Her hair was streaked with stark white, her face bruised and bloodied from interrogation. But her eyes, the same sharp hazel as Abigail's, burned with an unbreakable, defiant fire. "Stand down!" Director Reed screamed, drawing a heavy plasma revolver and pressing the searing hot barrel directly against Catherine's temple. "Take one more step, you genetic freaks, and I scramble her brains. Drop your weapons!" The dragons froze instantly. Cole lowered his cannon. Bradley's blade stopped spinning. Gideon's jaw tightened, his single amber eye narrowing in pure, burning hatred. They were designed for war, but they were bound by absolute loyalty to the woman in that chair. They wouldn't risk her. "You think you can just march into a coalition black site?" Reed spat, his hand trembling as he held the gun to Catherine's head. "She's government property. She possesses the genome sequencing for the Leviathan project. We need her to make more of you. Better versions of you. Compliant ones." Catherine coughed, blood trickling down her chin. She looked past the massive dragons, her eyes landing on the small figure standing behind Cole's massive leg. Her breath hitched. "Abby?" Reed laughed maliciously. "Oh, the daughter. How touching. I'll make sure she watches you bleed out before I have her shipped to a labor camp." Reed was entirely focused on the giant super soldiers. He was focused on the heavy weapons. He underestimated the 22-year-old waitress from Dust Creek. Abigail didn't raise her plasma pistol. Reed would see the glow of the coils charging and shoot her mother. Instead, her hand slipped into the deep pocket of her denim apron. Her fingers wrapped around the cold, familiar iron of the heavy pipe wrench she used to keep drunks in line at the Rusty Rivet. With a scream of pure, unbridled fury, Abigail stepped out from behind Cole. She twisted her hips, planting her foot, and threw the heavy iron wrench with every ounce of strength in her body. It was a perfectly blind, desperate throw, fueled by 5 years of pain. The heavy iron tool spun through the air in a blur, whistling past Gideon's shoulder. Crack. The wrench struck Director Reed squarely in the orbital bone with a sickening crunch. The sheer blunt force trauma snapped his head back violently. His eyes rolled into his skull, and the plasma revolver fired harmlessly into the ceiling as he collapsed backward, hitting the floor like a sack of wet grain, completely unconscious. For a split second, the room was dead silent. Even the dragons looked stunned. Then Bradley was moving. He closed the distance in a microsecond, his foot coming down hard on Reed's wrist, shattering it to ensure he wouldn't wake up and try again. Gideon rushed to the chair, his massive, taloned hands moving with astonishing gentleness as he ripped the thick steel restraints off Catherine's wrists and ankles. Catherine stumbled forward, and Abigail caught her. Mother and daughter collapsed onto the sterile floor, clutching each other fiercely. Abigail buried her face in her mother's shoulder, the tears she had held back for 5 years finally breaking free, sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm sorry, Abby," Catherine wept, kissing the top of her daughter's head, holding her tighter than she ever had. "I'm so sorry I left you. I thought it was the only way to keep you safe." "You idiot," Abigail sobbed, laughing through her tears. "I was working double shifts to pay off your fake debts." Catherine laughed, a broken, beautiful sound. She looked up over Abigail's shoulder at the 3 towering monsters standing guard around them. Gideon knelt, bowing his massive, scarred head in deep reverence. Cole and Bradley followed suit, dropping to one knee before the bruised, battered woman on the floor. "You found her," Catherine whispered, reaching out to touch Gideon's scarred cheek. "We are the Forsaken, Dr. Mercer," Gideon rumbled, his voice thick with emotion. "But we always protect our own, and anyone who bears the mark of the dragon is under our eternal protection." He looked down at Abigail, a profound respect shining in his remaining eye, especially one with such a deadly throwing arm. "We need to go," Bradley interrupted, his ears twitching. Station automated self-destruct was triggered when the director's vitals spiked. "We have 3 minutes before this rock turns into a supernova." Gideon stood up, effortlessly scooping Catherine into his massive arms as if she weighed nothing. "Abigail, stay close." They ran. They tore back through the shattered corridors, retracing their steps to the ironclad. Sirens wailed, and the deck began to shudder as the station's core overloaded. They bounded up the boarding ramp just as the primary bulkheads began to seal. "Punch it!" Gideon roared as he strapped Catherine into the co-pilot seat. Bradley slammed the thrusters to maximum. The stealth corvette violently wrenched itself free from the station's hull, diving backward into the icy void of space. A second later, Outpost Jericho erupted in a blinding flash of blue-white plasma, vaporizing the Coalition black site into a cloud of glowing radioactive dust. Inside the cargo hold, Abigail sat on the metal crate, breathing hard, watching the explosion through the viewport. The nightmare was over. Cole walked over to her, his massive frame shifting as he sat down on the deck beside her. He reached into one of his pouches and pulled out a small foil-wrapped square. He handed it to her. "What is it?" Abigail asked, wiping a smudge of grease and soot from her cheek. "Synthetic chocolate," the behemoth said softly. "It is terrible, but it is better than the coffee at your diner." Abigail let out an exhausted, genuine laugh. She leaned back against the cold metal hull, taking a bite of the terrible chocolate. She looked at her mother, safe in the cockpit, laughing with the scarred leader who had risked the entire galaxy to find her. The Earth Coalition had built the Leviathans to be unfeeling, unstoppable monsters. But as Abigail looked at the 3 giants who had just torn a military fortress apart to save a single human life, she realized the Coalition had failed completely. They hadn't built monsters at all. They had built family. And heaven help anyone who tried to mess with them again. What an incredible display of human willpower and dragon loyalty. The Earth Coalition might have thought they were in control, but they clearly underestimated the stubborn defiance of the Mercer women and the unbreakable bond of the 104th Battalion. If this HFY sci-fi drama got your adrenaline pumping, smash that like button, share this story with your friends, and hit subscribe so you never miss another epic tale. Drop a comment below. Would you have thrown the wrench or used the blaster? See you in the next video.